We are live.
Hello, everyone. This is Chmura. We are about 2 minutes from the top of the hour, and we'll get started, maybe giving people 1 extra minute to get in. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our economic update for 2026. It's 2 o'clock here, at least Eastern time, so let's give everyone just one more minute to get in before we go ahead and get started. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. My name's Chris Chmura, and I will be starting with some background information or some administrative things. So welcome, everyone. We're happy to have you here at this webinar. A few housekeeping items. Please do ask questions, and I see there's already one question out there, so I'm looking forward to getting to that later. There is a chat area where I see most of you now, and there's also a Q&A on the right-hand side if you could put your questions there. We may answer them as we see them or probably wait until the end of the presentation. We will be recording this, and so we'll get a video recording out tomorrow, maybe even later today, so that you can review or pass it on to some folks that you think might be of interest to them. So some background first on Chmura. So we were founded in 1998. We provide labor market analysis data, labor market analysis largely in our Jobs EQ software. We have some additional software in there as well, but we also have a consulting side of the business where we do a lot of different things: policy reports, economic impacts, strategic planning, gap analysis with regard to local demand and supply or higher ed. And our team of about nearly 60 economists, data scientists, statisticians, and business professionals really care about helping your community and your business grow. We're driven by your satisfaction and success, and excellence is at the top of everything we do. So we have a long roadmap of things that we're always adding to Jobs EQ, and would appreciate your feedback on what else you'd like to see in Jobs EQ, and also on the consulting side, making sure that our clients, that we give our clients above and beyond what the statement of work calls for is on top of mind for us. Here are some of the markets we serve: corporate, economic development, education, staffing, site selection, and workforce development. And here are some of the organizations that we've served over the many years. Before we get started here, one thing that we do, and we provide this pro bono, is an economic overview on a weekly basis. So here you're seeing a copy of one that we did over a year ago, and it's basically 4 pages. We send it out over the weekend. What came out this past week in terms of economic numbers, what's coming out next week, sort of what do the numbers mean on the second page. Has the Fed made any speeches that may impact policy on the third page, and then interest rates and financial data and a forecast. So if you'd like this, to get a copy of this on a weekly basis, feel free to click on the link when you get a copy of this, or go to our webpage, homepage, and at the very bottom you can sign up for it. So with that, I'm happy to let you know that James McCafferty, who's the director of Western Washington University, will be joining us and talking about the trade side of the economy. And I'll let him introduce himself and his agency or his association more before he speaks. So I'll speak first. I'm the chief economist and founder of Chmura Economics and Analytics, and I'll be talking to you about the U.S. outlook, opportunities and risks. And as I said, James will be centering in on the global trade forces in the economy overall, and with more specific information about the Washington economy, which is where he is located. So U.S. outlook, sort of an overview of what I'll be talking about. I'm going to hit on a lot of topics in a short period. So first, I'll talk about the drivers of growth based on long-standing economic issues and policies. Then we'll jump to 2 economic forecast scenarios that we have for how the economy may unfold in 26 and 27. There's something called a K recovery that's impacting both forecasts. And I'll give you more information on this later. But basically, if you haven't heard about the K recovery, it's a K-shaped recovery with the upper arm of the K is growing. The income groups are diverging. The lower arm of the K is stagnant or in decline. So different income groups in this economy are reacting differently and supporting it differently. Then we'll talk about why might a new Fed chair encourage faster growth? And is that okay, or is it driven by politics? And then I'll end with opportunities and risks. So first, four underlying factors that are driving the current administration's policy and the business action. So there are issues in this economy that need to be dealt with, and we may not agree with the way that it's being dealt with by this administration, but something needs to be done with these things. And so again, I'm going to give you a very high level view here, but I spent a lot of time talking about this in April of 2025. And you can go back to our website, and Anna is going to put in a link if you want to see that webinar and get more detail on all the historical data that supports these issues and shows how they're being addressed. But so we have primary policy drivers. We've got the trade deficit. We've got the federal budget deficit. It has been around. I've been giving presentations for over 40 years, and people have been asking me during that time, when will the deficit become an issue, and when will we start to see it getting smaller? Immigration reform is something that's been with us since the 1900s. And since that time, we've only had two different immigration policies passed by Congress, two big ones. And the last one was over 50 years ago. So something clearly needs to be done with immigration. And then productivity is always important. So from a policy perspective, we're seeing this administration encouraging R&D spending. But on top of that, we have AI layered that is really supporting this economy as well. So because of the trade deficit, we see this current administration put in tariffs to try to decrease the trade deficit. Because of the federal budget deficit, this current administration had a lot of federal layoffs and a lot of budget cuts. Because of the fact that we need immigration reform, this administration has closed the borders, and that has had an impact on labor availability. And from the productivity point of view, as I said earlier, we're seeing some enhancements to R&D, being able to write equipment purchases off quicker. And ultimately, productivity gains are important because they lead to increased living standards. So now, once we have all these policies in place, we can think about policies like billiards when you're playing pool. And when you hit the cue ball, it hits different balls, and then one ball might hit off another. And so you have primary, secondary, tertiary effects. And the same thing is what we see in the economy. So some of the secondary effects of the tariffs is that we may see inflation. We may see interest rate impacts because of all the policies here. We did see stock market impacts early on, and over the last few days, again, we've been seeing some stock market impacts. We see the unemployment rate going down, actually, and wages starting to go up. So these are some of the secondary effects that the businesses are dealing with. And again, this is a high-level view just to give you in the background, these big forces are driving policy changes in the current administration. And the April 2025 webinar I gave will give you more historical data on these issues if you have an interest. So now, jumping ahead to our two forecast scenarios, what I'm trying to do here is give you enough high-level information so that you can make a decision on your own. What do you think the forecast will look like next year? So we have a 100 or so equation model, and we economists will sit down and think about what's driving things, what the assumptions are that we put into the model. And we have a most likely forecast, which I'm calling right now modest growth. And then we have an alternative forecasts that I'm calling successful policy. So if the most likely does not occur, then we say, okay, what is the second most likely thing to happen? Are we going to see a recession next year? Are we going to see faster than expected growth? And we landed on, we're going to see much faster than expected growth if the policies are successful. So under the most likely, where we have modest growth, we have some continued uncertainty in the economy. A lot of what we felt in the last quarter and still going into the first quarter. But under this alternative model, the economy starts to improve and we see more strength that gives more confidence to businesses to spend. Under the most likely, again, under the first column, we have two Federal Reserve rate cuts because there's slow growth in the economy and they're trying to stimulate it. Under the second column of the alternative forecast, we have one Fed rate cut because the economy's showing some strength. Under the most likely, we're still trying to adjust to new tariffs. We're seeing some price increases. And as a result, the consumer spending is slowing because of inflation going up and lack of affordability. We see continued slower employment growth. But under the alternative scenario, there's less uncertainty about tariffs. The consumer spending starts to strengthen over the year because we're seeing some tax cuts. Remember, no tax on tips, on overtime, or at least to some level. And then wages start to outpace inflation. So good news, the consumer is doing much better in this alternative view. But again, back to the most likely, the first column, government spending continues to slow, and we see steady but not strong business investment. And you'll see as we go on in this presentation how important that business investment piece is. Under the alternative, we have strong productivity growth, and that is a result of the strong business growth. The tax incentives to increase R&D lead to big increases in business investment. And then the AI sees business spending as well on purchasing software, and those things together increase profits for businesses. So the second scenario of successful policies leads to much faster growth overall in the economy. So in terms of graphically, what do they look like? So here on the left-hand side, I'm showing you employment. The gray shaded bar is historical data, and actually in this case, the 2025 blue and orange, those are actually historical data as well. We have data through December. So employment grew 0.9% in 25. The forecast blue is most likely and red is the alternative or orange alternative. You can see that the alternative grows 0.5 percentage point much faster than the most likely. And in 2027, it continues to grow faster than the most likely. And that leads to faster consumer spending. And this is very important because consumer spending makes up about 70% of GDP. So when consumers are doing well, so is GDP. So again, going back to 2024, 2.9%. 2025 looks like it's coming in around 2.6 to 2.7. If we see the moderate growth, which is most likely in blue, 2.4% growth this year, and then slows to 2.1% in consumer spending next year. But if we see the successful policies, we'll see faster growth, 3% consumer spending in 26 and 2.7 in 27. Two other important things, as I said earlier, real non-residential investment expenditures, and that's spending on the business side. It's made up of equipment. So businesses are spending on machinery and computers. They're spending on structures, buildings, offices, factories, and they're spending on intellectual property products, software, and the like. So this causes huge increases in productivity. So looking at 2024 in the chart, 2.9%, 2025 looks like it's coming in about 4.2%. And then as we go to 26, 5% spending in the alternative with 4% in the most likely. And then that increases to 6.5 in the alternative and 5.3 in the most likely. Again, very important component of GDP that causes the economy to grow faster. And so the slide on the right is really, as an economist, many people would think this is hard to believe. An alternative forecast of 3.4% GDP growth in 26 and 3.3 in 27, but still decent growth, although not quite as strong, 2.6 under the most likely in both years. But again, 3.4 for 2 years in a row and for an annual rate would be quite outstanding. So now let's move on to the K economy. And it remains in both scenarios, but it's more pronounced in the most likely scenario. So here, when we look at the K economy again, this time I'm looking at the lower arm of the K, and that's the lower income group is diverging in terms of the spending that's going on in the economy and the wealth that they're seeing, the increase in wealth. And so if you go all the way back to 2021, January, which is when this slide begins, you can see that the blue dotted line, the green dotted line, which is average hourly earnings for production and non-supervisory workers, is growing faster than inflation, which is the blue line. But then we go through COVID, the COVID spike, and then the spike in inflation, the blue, that continued through 2022, and then starting to slow in 2023, 2024. But the problem is the wages for production and non-supervisory workers never did keep pace. And over the past 5 years, more disconcerting, it's not keeping pace with inflation. So how does that impact low-income workers? What it means is that they are not making enough money to buy what they had bought in the past. To give you some examples, eggs, for example, in January 2021 were $1.47 for a dozen grade A eggs. The CPI data goes down to that fine level of detail if you're interested in looking up other things. $1.47 for a dozen eggs in January 2021 rose to $2.71 in December of 25. So that's an 84% increase over that time. Now, there are some things like the bird flu that causes prices to go up and may come down a bit, but it's unlikely that we're going to see eggs coming all the way back to $1.47. And in fact, if we look at the entire CPI index, its level was at 262 in January of 21, and its current level is 326. So it's gone up 24% since January of 21. And you say, well, how do I even think about that? Well, one way to think about it is I went into the healthcare services industry and I looked at their wages. The average wage of someone working in healthcare services in the U.S. was $34,700 in the first quarter of 2021. And the latest data we have is the third quarter of 25. Their average wages rose to $40,500. So over that period, you saw an increase in wages for healthcare workers, home healthcare service workers, of 17%. Over the same time, inflation went up 24%. So it's clear that they're not making enough money, enough of an increase in their wages to be able to buy what they had in the past. And as a result, lower income workers are not purchasing as much, or they're purchasing less expensive items than they had in the past. So now we go on to the higher income of the K recovery. So we're looking at the upper arm that is growing. And in this case, I still haven't gotten totally to the higher wage income workers, because in blue, again, you're seeing inflation, but in green, you're seeing the average hourly earnings of all employees, the percent change from a year ago in each of those. And so again, focus your eyes back at January 2021, and you could see that wages were growing year over year quite fast, around 5%, whereas inflation was much lower. And we did see wages still stay around 5%, did not get quite to where inflation was, but then starting to grow faster than inflation. Inflation right now is around 4%, the latest data, and inflation right now is about 2.8%, and wages for all workers are increasing about 4% year over year. So a second piece of what's been driving the wealthier individuals to be able to spend more is the stock market. So here you're seeing the Dow Jones Industrial Average over time. And since about February of 2025, the stock market has risen 12% through the January of this year. But if we go all the way back to August of 23, the stock market has increased 40% through the end of this year. So wealthy individuals have more money to spend. There's no quick standard definition of what the high income bracket is. But if we take the top 20% of all workers, that would be about $170,000 or greater. And that group is driving the consumer spending in this economy, the vast amount of consumer spending in this economy. So with that, before I move on to our next section, let me go back and let's see if we could take a quick poll. Anna's going to put up a poll that says, ask you the question. If you click on the poll dot there, which forecast will be most accurate over the next 2 years? Will it be the most likely or the alternative? And we'll give you a minute to answer that. And it looks like it's coming up very strong, about 79-80% with the most likely. Interesting, I didn't want to say this ahead of time, but I'm starting to lean toward the alternative as the more likely forecast. But okay, so thank you for that. And let us move on to the next slide here. So the next section here is, before we get to the opportunities and risks, why might a new Fed chair encourage faster economic growth? And is that okay, or is it just driven by politics? And so here I'm showing you a line, that line, upward sloping line. Theoretically, that is the potential growth rate of the economy. And theoretically, there's some number associated with it. But if we can get to that goal, and right now we think it's around 1.8%, if we can grow the economy at 1.8%, then when we go into a recession, it won't be as deep, and neither will the growth periods be as strong. So we don't have a spike and then a sharp decline in economic activity. And the reason for that is because when we go through inflation periods, capacity is being overutilized. So what we have available in the economy is being overutilized. The unemployment rate is falling very low. Maybe it's getting down to 2 or 3%. Factory utilization rates start to go up. We have slower deliveries of goods. And when you have slower deliveries of goods, it's because you can't get enough created because there's so much demand. And then during those periods, the factories and the businesses are able to raise their price. So the Fed will increase the interest rate to slow the economy. But during the disinflation periods, where we have a high unemployment rate, sales is falling, COVID would be an extreme example here. The Fed decreases interest rates to try to get people to spend more in the economy. So how do we determine what potential GDP is? Said differently, and you'll really have to stay with me here because we're in Econ 202, or at least, what provides capacity in the U.S. economy? So how do we get to, which is what potential GDP is, how do we get to what potential GDP is? There's two factors of production. One is capital. So that would lead to labor productivity increases. And here we're looking at investment in new equipment and software is very important to lead to labor productivity. The second thing that helps us determine what that potential growth rate is for the economy is the labor force, the number of workers. And this is much easier to predict than labor productivity because you have people that are born, they start to work at the age of 18 or 22 or 23, or at least you hope that they do. We have labor force participation rates. And so that's much easier to predict than the capital piece of this equation. So then more specifically, it's very complicated to determine potential GDP growth rate, but here's a simple way of looking at it. And Here we look at the productivity growth rate, we add to it the labor force growth rate, and it gives us potential GDP growth rate. So the productivity growth rate on average, annual average between 2024 and 2029 is predicted to be 1.4% by the CBO. I just threw in 1.6 as a little bit of a upper arm there. The labor force growth rate is predicted by the CBO to be 0.4% on an annual average over the next 5 years. It may be less due to the decrease in immigration that we're seeing. So that's something that may change. And if those two things are correct, if productivity grows 1.4% and labor force grows 0.4%, potential GDP is 1.8. However, let's say that productivity grows much faster. Let's say productivity grows 3% instead of 1.6%. If productivity grows 3%, then we add 3% to 0.4 and it equals 3.4. That means the potential growth rate for this economy can be 3.4%, meaning that the Fed can allow the economy to grow as fast as 3.4% without having to increase interest rates to slow it down. So I hope this is making sense to all of you. But has this ever happened before? It did in the late 1990s and early 2000. Greenspan was in the Fed at the time, and he saw these signs of productivity growth. The potential growth rate was thought to be about 2 to 2.5%. But given all the growth and productivity, he thought he could let this economy grow to 3 to 3.5%. And indeed, he let that happen, and we did not see a pickup inflation over his term. So bottom line, yes, it is possible to see this economy growing faster because of productivity growth, and it not be a political reason why the person who's the new Fed governor is allowing it to grow faster. So one more chart before I get to opportunities and threats. Is 3% productivity growth possible? Here's productivity growth over time, year-over-year change, and take your eyes back to about 2019, the last Trump administration, where we saw productivity picking up just before COVID to getting above 3%. So given his policies in the past, we were seeing that decrease in deregulation help there, as well as increase in R&D spending. And then all the way to the right, the latest data just starting to show an increase in productivity. So this is one thing that we are watching very carefully to see if the 2026 alternative forecast will come to pass. So in terms of opportunity, assuming that we see some reduced uncertainties and faster productivity growth starting in the second quarter, workforce and education, especially an important time to improve student and client income with short-term classes and certifications that grow, that support A&I growth. Economic development, reshoring is continuing, but the rural areas have more land available for mega projects, so there's a big opportunity for rural areas. Businesses, deregulation reduction in taxes, productivity gains are all leading to profits rising toward the end of this year. Wages increasing from productivity gains will help employees. On the risk side, clearly geopolitical uncertainties increase business uncertainty, and then that causes businesses to not spend as much because their uncertainty of their own growth paths. The large budget deficit that we have eventually could lead to higher interest rates if we don't start to bring that down. And at the same time, the third bullet point, it might shift investment away from the U.S. That would cause the interest rate that's along end to rise even faster. We have an AI bubble market. Some people think, some others don't. If we do, and that bursts, that could have an impact on consumer spending. And then tariffs, if they are passed on to customers and we see inflation accelerate, that could lead to issues as well as additional tariffs. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to James. But Anna, let's not take that second poll. Let's hold off on that because we seem to be taking a little longer on the presentation here.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Chris. It's always fun listening to other people talk about the economy. I'm so glad to be here today. Thank you for this opportunity. Just as a quick summary, I direct the Center for Economic and Business Research at Western Washington University. Our center is an applied research center, which means we engage with the general public. So we work with businesses and public policy agencies and bodies, legislators, counties, ports, etc. And we work to do data analysis for them. So it could be straight economic work, economic impact analyses, and those exciting things. But it also can be public opinion work and gathering primary data collection and then building analytic frameworks for them so they can make their own decisions based on having good information grounding and good information sources. So that's what we do. But today I wanted to focus on global trade forces to talk about. And Washington State is a good state to use as a guinea pig for this because we've got a few companies here that do a lot of exporting. You've probably heard of some of them. But there's a couple of headlines here I want to share with you. So here's from a recent New York Times out of Seattle Port. Rocked by tariffs, there were 70 jobs for 600 workers. That sounds pretty dire. And I will tell you that the Port of Seattle and the Port of Tacoma have seen some pretty dramatic shifts, and we'll look at that in a minute. But there have been times when there are no boats for them to work with. And so they're working obviously with cargo that's already landed or getting ready to go. But there's been times when their piers have been empty. And that's a big deal. And they really haven't seen anything like this since the Great Recession of 2008 to do that. From Bloomberg here just a couple of weeks ago, U.S. container growth vanishes with world trade flows moving on. And I really want you to look at that red line. That's North America, which also includes Canada. And I'll pull that out in just a minute and show you that red line for the U.S. is significantly lower. We are seeing a lot less container traffic into North America. And that's going to be continuing to be a growing challenge. This came out last week as well. UPS cutting up to 30,000 jobs, and they are laying this on the feet of Amazon and the fact that they are just getting fewer packages. And this is primarily drivers and delivery. This is in-point folks that they are laying off. 30,000 is a big number for a company the size of UPS with the national presence. In the Seattle Times, as I was getting this prepared for you today, I got hit by these three alerts, one right after the other. 2,000 people laid off from Amazon, 400 people from T-Mobile, 200 from Zillow. There's been a couple companies that are saying they're going to be declaring bankruptcy. We have some pretty large shifts happening in the Seattle and in Washington State, and they're all interconnected, and that's the challenge, right? We can't just say, oh, it's because of the tariffs, or oh, it's because of this policy. It's a stew, and all these things are mixed together, and they result in these kinds of headlines. So we're going to talk about trade flows, and I have to caution you. Being a data nerd, we have to be aware of data lags, right? We don't know the whole story of 2025 yet in so many different ways. But in trade flow data, we typically have a couple of months delay in the data set. So we really don't know how the end of the year is going to shape up at this point. But we do know that Q3 and Q4, from the data we do have, are pretty dramatic. We've seen significant growth in Canadian ports. And just because, ports are one of those weird things. The West Coast ports handle about 51% of the ocean-going cargo in the U.S. The Gulf Coast handles about 6%, and the East Coast is handled about 43%. And you can see this table over here, and I'm going to pull this table up a couple different times. Now I'll give a nod to the National Retail Federation for their support of us getting this data through the Global Port Tracker. But you can see they've got these nice up arrows and down arrows. And you can see the down arrows in the year over year in November, for example. And the green arrows you're seeing there, if you look over, those are all Canadian ports. And so the U.S. ports have all had either significant downshifts, slight upticks, or slight downticks. And so this is going to be a much bigger deal as the data continues to roll out in these days moving forward. And my mouse has decided to stop moving, and I cannot move the slide, which is always a good time. There we go. So each port processes a very different volume. And so that's the other piece. When we think about the ports, they're all different sizes, right? And so if you have an iPhone, for example, anywhere you are in the U.S., that iPhone has been to Los Angeles because every iPhone that's sold in the United States transgresses the Port of Los Angeles. And so you get very different volumes through them. So without the Canadian ports here, the U.S. total for this table, which is non-inclusive of all the ports, would say the U.S. has seen a likely growth of around 0.5%, which isn't very much. But the obvious risk is the continued erosion to non-U.S. ports. But it's not a complete data set, right? So if we looked at a complete data set for U.S. ports that we have to date, we'd actually see a contraction of 0.4. And so if we have one data set suggesting 0.5 and another one saying, well, it's more complete, it's a negative 0.4, we are likely to see a negative number there. But of course, we got to worry about what December's data is going to really look like. And so the year-over-year trend of that with the complete data set would suggest a 5 to 7% decrease in U.S. ports. And then ports have really big swings in them already. Historically, it's not unusual to see up to a 10% swing in port traffic data. Companies are moving stuff around at different times of the year. Timing's a little different. Maybe we ordered our Christmas inventory early like we did this year. Maybe we pushed it off a little bit longer like we've done in other years. So seasonal routing shifts, we really don't know. And that's going to be the challenging part from the data side of this. Is I can say, yeah, well, if we look at the year-over-year trend, 5 to 7%, that doesn't sound seasonal. That sounds more like route shifts. And if it's route shifts, that could be more permanent. And not just kind of in the moment. The good news, and I put that in quotes, the good news is that it may not get that much worse. Trade flows seem to have adapted, and that's that shifting I was talking about there. The modes of entry seem to be changing. And so historically, 79% of imports into the U.S. have come in by boat, mostly in containers of different sizes and shapes. Rails and pipeline, about 17%, trucks and planes around 7%. But if you look at this table or chart rather, you'll notice that the tariffs being collected by the Treasury are dropping. That's being fueled in part by some change in demand, but it's also being fueled by this change of destination. So we're seeing cargo going into Vancouver and up into Canada. We're also seeing cargo being rerouted to Mexico, where it's being brought into the U.S. by train and by truck under NAFTA, which has been renamed. And so we're seeing we're seeing this reallocation of what's the Schedule B numbers on what things are being brought in under and getting these lower tariffs as well. So that's the good news, is that the ports may only be looking at this up to 5 to 7% shift because of the things that have already taken place. 3 of the ports that are highlighted have had really significant drops. Seattle at almost 9%, Jacksonville just over 8%, and Virginia at close to 7%. These are ports that traditionally have had the most elastic demand because they are medium-sized ports, if you will, which I'm sure my friends in Seattle would shake their head a little bit when I call them a medium-sized port. They're just not as large. And so companies will often trim their service, reroute their service, trying to find some scales of efficiency. Seattle competes with Vancouver and LA, for example. And so if people are bringing in a little bit less cargo, they're more likely to route that through Vancouver or LA to save on the extra boat trip into Seattle. And you can see in this chart here, this is the U.S. container imports and how in July we really saw that downward slope. It took time for the tariffs and things to take effect as those rolled out. And so that's when we see the negative growth coming in. So Anna, we put together a quiz, that sounds so schooly, a little poll that we want to take a look at. So what I'd like to see is just kind of ask the audience on what you think is going to happen with this. So Anna, can you throw that up? This is really fascinating. It's kind of like on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire here. You get to see how the audience votes. It's interesting to me that the container volume rebounds has been a late climber here. Early voters here are looking at rerouting and port volumes keep eroding. The as you guys have picked up on, the flow to Mexico and Canada may actually be something that really happens here, and that rerouting. So kind of a trick question, because both of those are kind of the same questions. And we've seen some really crazy things with ports. As you finish your voting here, the auto industry, for example, for a while, it was less expensive to export partially created automotive parts to China, to have magnets installed and have it shipped back to the US than to import the magnets. So we're seeing some really fun, creative solutions to tariffs as we move on. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and keep moving forward here. So the economic impacts of this is really where we kind of get into, right? I mean, it's I don't know, it's fun to talk through the policy and talk about the implications of it. But being the good economists, right, we're like, okay, but how do we drill this into actual usable numbers that we might want to have discussions about? And so when we think about the economic impacts of change in port traffic, the first thing I have to think about is there's going to be less goods, decrease availability, right? So if we have less goods coming into the US, I'm going to start thinking about price pressure. I'm going to think about what that does with lower sales volumes. And I'm going to say that that becomes mixed. It's really hard to tease those out because they get mixed in with inflationary consumer changes. So how much of inflation is attributed to trade flow changes? There's no way to really know for sure. We know that it's influencing inflation, but we really don't know an exact number. We can't say, well, 0.25 of inflation is attributed to. We could come up with ranges, but that would be about the best we could do. The lower volumes also means there's going to be less demand for movement. And so ports, when we think about, most of the time we do economic impact studies, we're looking at a particular sector or maybe a combination of a couple of sectors. Ports cross a lot of different sectors. And so we think about the actual port operations. We think about the initial movement of those goods off the port property to a warehouse or to some other type of facility. We think about more transportation from there to a different facility. Eventually we get to a platform, right? Whether it's a truckload of something or an individual items at your local target. So we're thinking that we're going to impact all of the steps and stages there. I've seen some analysis that said, we could be looking at a worst case scenario where we see physically less days of trucking in the US. And given the really high demand for truck drivers right now because of other policies, that may not be a bad thing because that will decrease the cost pressure on movement by truck. And so again, it's a truly a very, very big mixed basket of possible economic influences. The bigger thing, though, is the decreasing efficiency. So all of these things are very capital intensive. And so if we have decreased return on assets, decreasing return on investment, that's going to lead to less capital going in. It's going to lead to people not making those kinds of investments. And those have pretty large economic consequences to them because these are expensive, large pieces of equipment that have to be used to get these containers movement. So I mentioned a whole slew of different possible industries or NAICS codes, and this is just a laundry list of the top level ones. These are the ones that we come up with at the very top. I could probably build you in a list of another 20 or 30 after it. I sometimes will make a joke with rooms that I'm talking with that it's really hard to find things around you that hasn't been on a train at some point. In the United States, because most of the things that you have around you every day have been on a train at some point, or at least some form of the components were on a train at some point. It's been on a semi-truck. A lot of things have been in an ocean container. And so we have a lot of these NAICS codes that come together. And so to do this kind of analysis and really dig into it, you'd build a pretty large custom sector, which again leads us to really hard conversations about how much influence does this one attribute have inside that large sector. Fortunately for us, the Northwest Seaport Alliance, which is the ports in the Seattle area, so Port of Seattle, Port of Tacoma are in the Northwest Seaport Alliance. They recently had an economic impact study done, so I didn't have to do the work, which was great. And so I was able to take out of that in a table that gave me an idea of what they were projecting as far as their multipliers. Fantastic. And for fun, I went into the JobsEQ multiplier tool, which is a fun way to go in and do this very quickly. And I said, just pull me this port and harbor operations. I want to get a comparison. So we see here in jobs the Northwest Seaport Alliance came up with a multiplier of 2.9. So for every job that is at, direct within the port itself, they're accounting for another 1.9 into those mix of industries. When we just look at port and harbor operations, it's a 2.16 coming out of Jobs EQ. And of course, we always treat these as ranges, right? Is the answer really 2.16? Is the answer really 2.9? It's in that ballpark, right? And we look at compensation and we can look at output and we can make those same kind of comparisons. And we can see that how the industries have those other industries are affecting the multiplier. And just like we see in other supply chain type operations, the latter contributors often don't contribute that much, except when you're talking in the dollar amounts we are. And then those are real numbers. So the Global Port Tracker estimated a 6.5% decrease in TEUs. And so if you're not a total shipping nerd, a TEU is it's a shipping container equivalent. So it's basically taking all of the different containers, and they come in different heights and different lengths, same widths, but they come in these different sizes. And so we just mathematically make them all 20 foot. And so it allows us to compare apples to apples between ports. It allows us to do an easier job of manipulating the numbers. So a 6.5% decrease in Washington ports leads to about 150,000 TEUs a month. That's about $7.5 billion in fewer goods a month, or about $90 billion annually. Now, again, I didn't put this in the slides. I have to caution you, when you're looking at import and export data, you're going to find that almost all the import and export activity in the U.S. happens at the ports, because that's where it's tracked from. So a farmer grows something in Iowa, they put it on a train, they send it to Seattle, they put it on a boat, it's listed as an export out of Washington State. And it's just the port of exit is how we track those. So we have to look carefully when we're doing global trade data, because the impacts are not just in the location the data might suggest. But moving from cargo value to impacted jobs is where it gets challenging, right? Because we're not looking at $90 billion change in function at the port, because it's not the port. That's in the U.S. economy, perhaps. And even then, that would be a wholesale value. It wouldn't be a retail value. And so trying to come up with a math between that is where we get to have a little fun. So, the Northwest Seaport Alliance is among the top container ports in the United States. Even though it is kind of a medium-sized port, it handles roughly 3.3 million TEUs a year and works with about $76 billion in waterborne trade, with about 180 global partners in 2024. So their analysis comes up with the conclusion that for every 35 TEUs, it supports one job somewhere in Washington State, which means there's a 28.6 total jobs per 1,000 TEUs. So if we have 150,000 fewer TEUs potentially, we're talking about 4,300 potentially impacted jobs in Washington State. That does not include the ripple effect that may occur in other states and other locations, right? Because it's a very simplified analysis. So if we very loosely, and I put that in quotes, you have to go with me on this, if we loosely apply the impact analysis numbers nationally, and there's some reason why we could, they're going to be similar. So I'm going to use my tilde here quite liberally and say, if we loosely apply that, it's around 112,000 fewer TEUs nationally, which rolls out to about 3,200 jobs being impacted nationally. And you're like, hold up a second. You just told me that Washington State, it's going to be a decrease of 4,290, but nationally it's 32. Yes, because cargo is being rerouted. And so we have to look at the net as well as the local, right? So if I'm talking to people within Washington State, we're very concerned about our local impact or our statewide impact. Or if you're talking nationally or multi-state regionally, you're going to come up with different numbers. And so your regions are all going to vary in how and who you're having this conversation with. And so tread carefully to do this. And I'll be very honest with you, this kind of analysis, I haven't seen this analysis done very many other places. And so we're still kind of grappling, I think, as a profession with how we're going to try and talk about this change in trade value when it comes to jobs holistically. So if we stress test this and say this 5 to 7% year over year is a trend and not seasonal, and I go back to my poll, and you all seem to back me up on the theory that this really looks more like a trend and not seasonal, we're really talking about 2 to 3 fewer larger ships at U.S. ports per day. That's about 2 million fewer TEUs, which would be $80 to $120 billion in less goods, which is actually a national impact of 56,000 jobs. So if it's just a small decrease on the other slide, it's not, we're talking 3,000, 4,000 jobs. Okay, but if it's truly a shift, if we're really talking about this trend and it truly is not seasonal, we're really talking about 56,000 jobs, if not more, if we roll it out and then we start talking about retailers and places that are going to be impacted by this as well. Now, when we look at that kind of level of shift in ports, we haven't seen that kind of a shift unless we look at what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, or if we look back at the really good time we had in 2008. And so this is a pretty significant risk to the ports and to the U.S. economy if it continues to be a trend and not just a seasonal realignment process.
Say, James, before you end,
Yes.
actually, if you go back to that previous slide, Shelby asked, is the 3,200 impacted jobs just port jobs or all jobs?
That would be port jobs is where that's going to look at. So if we just looked at those impact analysis numbers, I'm going to flip back again. So here we are looking at the seaport. This is just the Seattle ports, right? Seattle and Tacoma. I'll get in trouble for my Tacoma friends. So this is the jobs within just the port itself. So that's that. If we just look at that very simplified NAICS, right? So this is then when we carry that forward, that's when we look at this slide here, this is still just looking at a very simplified NAICS. And then when we roll it out to the much larger NAICS, or not NAICS, but industry cluster, that's when we get these kinds of numbers as they're much larger. All right, and I'm going to do a quick commercial that we post a ton of stuff on social media every week. We post 6 to 8 things every day that we read in different news outlets, or things that we read we disagree with. We're pretty prolific posters. Please, if you are interested in this kind of thing, give us a follow. You can hear that. We do a quarterly podcast. We publish a regional forecast. You can get a lot more information about us through all these various places you've got on your screen. And at that, I will flip it back to Chris.
Terrific information. Thanks, James. Thanks. Another question here I see that probably would be best for you from David. Will an increase in utilization of foreign trade zones in the U.S. help mitigate tariff impacts?
Absolutely. And this is the one thing that has shocked me, and I've shared this, I don't know how, at this point, with how many people, and it's a very astute question. So again, we got a pretty good sized crowd today. So if you're not familiar with the free trade zones or the other things that get called, it's basically a no man's land. So you import goods into the U.S. The idea is that some sort of value added manufacturing happens in that zone, and then they leave out of that zone under, they still get tariffs applied, but they get it applied under the resulting Schedule B or the classification number for the good. And so you can bring in something, for example, that has a high tariff on it, transform it into a product that doesn't have a high tariff on it, and then import it into the U.S. out of there. And of course, you get all the labor advantages and construction advantages and things to have these areas. They are scattered all over the country. In Washington, we have one county that the entire county is considered that kind of a zone. They can allocate anywhere they want to do it. So it hasn't been used as much as I would have expected at this point. But I really think it's because a lot of companies are still struggling with figuring out, is this permanent? Is this going to go away in 6 weeks and I don't have to worry about it anymore? The uncertainty, I think, is preventing us from seeing conscientious plans that would make those kind of investments.
Interesting. Another one, I'll start it, and then maybe, James, you can add on. Someone said reshoring in 2026, they really hadn't seen any of that happening. Are we really seeing reshoring? And clearly we are seeing it, some of it though, has been announced but hasn't been built yet. Like in Virginia, we have AstraZeneca, Eli Lilly, Merck. So pharmaceuticals, clearly semiconductors. James, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think we're going to see more of it, but again, it takes a while, right? I mean, it's one thing to say I'm going to build a factory, and then a whole other thing to actually build it, get it occupied, actually get it. I mean, it's years to get things done, and so we get really excited about the announcements, but it's not going to show up in the economic data for years. The only thing I can say is our manufacturing employment is dropping, and so from a short-term perspective, I don't think we've seen any kind of real boost from it. Now, long-term, that goes back to Chris, your forecast, right? If these policies go as planned, then maybe we will.
Yeah, and this question I think leads into it as well. In which industries do you see the greatest opportunities? Clearly, healthcare is one where we're seeing expected continued growth. James, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, as I look up communities, it really is healthcare. And I think that kind of gets to a misnomer because in most cases, we're not talking about brain surgeons. We're not talking about high pay jobs in healthcare. And there's some. A lot of the jobs that are in healthcare are typically lower paying home health and nursing assistants. And they're not high wage jobs. And so that's something that we'll have to kind of check yourself as you talk about healthcare being in demand. Go back and figure out what SOC codes are we really talking about and what kind of wages are we really talking about for those jobs.
Yeah, as a point there, the example I gave was home health aides, and you saw that their income was only in the 40,000 range, not the higher income you would expect of surgeons and people working at hospitals. And here's one, and then I haven't asked you, James, but maybe you can give your thoughts after mine here. Someone was asking why, Dr. Chmura, are you leaning toward that alternative, faster growth economy? And I don't know, James, where he is on this, so it'll be interesting to hear when I'm done here. But largely because of the business spending, that's going to increase productivity, and that's going to really increase wages. That's going to help consumer spending. Some of the tax decreases that we're seeing for consumers that are lower income consumers, like restaurant workers who won't be paying taxes on all of their tips, or overtime workers. We're starting to see a little movement in the real estate market, which sees a big ripple effect. And then finally, something that's very hard to measure the forward impact of is the deregulation that we're seeing right now. That frees up a lot of time for businesses to put into more productive activities. But James, you may even be on the negative side. Maybe you're looking for a recession. I haven't asked you this. What's your outlook for 26 in terms of GDP?
I'm going to say I'm more cautiously pessimistic. I think we'll see positive GDP, but I worry about when I look at things like consumer confidence. The University of Michigan consumer confidence, we're lower than at any other point of time in that study. And you look at that and you're like, wow, people are really, really, really worried. It's the number one question I get as I go out to talk to people. What's going on in the economy? I'm worried about this. I'm worried about that. When I look at the number of jobs being posted, we're, in some communities, half or less of what we were year over year in the number of jobs. I think about consumer spending in the K-shape and how long does that 10% of spenders really keep that up? Because it's that 10% is out of the 20% of top household net worth bundle, right? So you have half of the wealthy people shopping. How long do they keep that up? And we're seeing really weird things. Like if you look at airlines, Delta recently announced that they're selling out in first and business class and having a hard time filling coach. And so again, that K-shape, I worry about that, which makes me worried that GDP is going to get hit with some slower growth. And again, if the policies play out, then maybe we recover from that, but it's going to take time.
All right. Thanks, James. One other question early on, working population is in decline. Actually, the working population is still growing, but it's growing at a slower rate. So just something to consider in terms of that person asking that question. And then here we're about at time. So let's just try to answer this last one quickly. And then we'll thank everyone for coming. Question from Kevin, how sensitive are the productivity growth predictions to the return on investment we see from artificial intelligence? That seems to be where business spending is bullish, but I don't see those investments transforming productivity yet. Gosh, that's something really hard to measure. And in fact, we're working with a professor he's asking us for data from our job postings, because you can really tease out skills and product and types of jobs and titles, and that, because there are a lot of unanswered questions there. There's not a lot of research that has been done on that, but I think that's something that's yet to be answered. James, do you have any other insight on that?
The productivity is definitely going to come on the technology side of the labor market transformation we're seeing. I mean, we are seeing much slower population growth. We're seeing a lot of people being taken out of the economy and not backfilling that, right? The long-term projections don't look great for that. So yeah, we're thinking about the McDonald's that doesn't have any employees. We're thinking about when you go to different places where you punch in your own order and you do it, and it maybe they've got a handful of employees instead of 30. And so we're seeing an increase in productivity, but it's a different kind of increase, I think, than we've seen in the past.
Thank you, James. Thanks. It's been great doing this webinar with you, and thank you for your views on the trade side and for answering all these questions. And those of you in the audience, thank you for attending, and let us know of topics that you would like to hear about in the future. Have a good rest of your day.